A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're going to be talking drug education, what our kids are being taught. You know, there's a prevailing thinking that says schools are best placed to provide young people with the skills and knowledge to make sound choices and decisions in drug education. And that means teachers must be adequately trained in drug education. Well, our special guest today says education works, but he's questioning what is being taught and how is it being taught. A conversation today about what our kids are being taught in school around drug and alcohol education. We're back with drug educator Shane Varcoe. He is CEO at Dalgarno Institute. It's one of the 450 plus member organisations of the World Federation Against Drugs across 71 countries these days. Dalgarno, a health education charity, and a special welcome back to 2020 to you, Shane Varcoe.
Great to be here again, Neil, and Happy New Year to you and your listeners.
Thanks so much, Shane. Shane, whenever we talk, I always like to get some sort of a national snapshot. What's happening with drugs in Australia? And, we've come to some pretty bleak conclusions about things in the past times. What's your impression here if we're talking about drugs, alcohol, all sorts of different ways that young people particularly, but all people, can be affected by these things?
Yeah, sure, Neil. It's an interesting phenomenon what we're seeing happen in the alcohol and drug space. Of course, the National Drug Strategy deals with three major categories: alcohol, tobacco, and illicit drugs. And we've seen over the last 10 years, particularly around alcohol, a fairly concerted pushback against the very high-profile, big alcohol push into the public space to try and generate consumption and increase customers and pitching a lot of stuff at young people. I mean, that's been gone after pretty hard by the government and the public sector. So we've seen some really shifts in that, which has been great. And of course, the tobacco issue was really gone after. It took 30 years to get that campaign up and running. And of course, the Quit campaign has been a great success. But that's only been going a little bit backwards because of the advent and promotion and push of e-cigarettes and vaping, of course. That was a great sabotaging tool, which we can talk about later on. But that was incredibly problematic. And we've seen a big pushback in that space as well. But when it comes to illicit drugs, we've got this cognitive dissonance, Neil. We're seeing the rise, the consistent use of crystal meth in certain areas. Cocaine is a huge issue in this country. We're one of the world's best destinations for cocaine traffickers because we pay the most for it. So there's a whole lot of things going on, and there's a lot of reasons behind that, and public policy and bad education practice are big key issues in that. And we'll talk about that today, hopefully.
I read one report, Australians' favourite drug, cannabis. Now, I think this is outside of alcohol and tobacco, but cannabis there coming in second, according to this report, methamphetamine, more commonly called ice. Then on average, we're consuming more cocaine, ice, ketamine, MDMA and fentanyl. Fentanyl consumption's been steadily increasing since 2022. Experts are beginning to take note. When we talk about those, and that's not even prescription drugs and all sorts of others. Thoughts here around, is that a fair enough sort of assessment?
Yeah, it is. I didn't want to drill down into that specifically, but thanks for raising that. Yeah, cannabis is a big one, of course, and that's its own little category. We've been focusing on that as an institute for over a decade now. We saw this coming. And again, cannabis is the most commonly used drug because it's the most aggressively marketed as the most harmless of the substances in play. And of course, we know now from the from the high THC content that this is far from the truth. And whilst it may not rate in the same category perhaps as crystal meth, it's getting closer and closer with some of this high-end THC content. But yeah, it is problematic. And of course now, one of the things about the alcohol consumption issue, and then one of the sneaky things that's been done by the pro-cannabis lobby is what used to be called California sober. In other words, young people are swapping out alcohol for weed, and they think that's a better option, which, of course, is clearly not, and we can talk about that at length as well. But again, these are education vehicles that are used. These are what I call the tacit education vehicles that are used in culture to convince people that things are a certain way, and they're not. Yeah.
Shane, the thing is, and why this might be important to talk about, is because families are paying a dreadfully high price for what's happening with our alcohol, tobacco and drug consumption in Australia. Families can be torn apart, can't they, through these drug issues, the problems that they create?
Oh, it's horrendous, Neil. I think anyone who's been involved in this space, and we certainly spent a lot of time, not just with the recovery alumni, those who have fallen off the precipice of drug use and into the chaos of addiction, and they've kind of worked their way back out. It takes a long, long time. It's not an easy fix. But their families, that's horrendous enough, but their families suffer a huge issue. And even recently, there was a coroner's report and final legislative report came out about a young 16-year-old boy who drank himself to death on Christmas Day a couple of years back because his parents thought it's okay to supervise his early drinking and gave him alcohol sips and whatnot at a very young age. And that, of course, was a huge problem back 20 years ago. This kind of parental supervision of early drinking is better than the kids going out and drinking on their own. But again, the education was very badly done because we know all alcohol consumption, no matter how small, to the developing brain is problematic. And so this young man actually drank himself to death at a family function on Christmas Day because this idea of, oh, look, I'm being responsible in developing this. Now, that family's lost a teenage boy, and the community's mourning for that. But again, that's just one of the shocking outcomes of a really, really toxic culture that continues to breed the idea that certain substances are manageable, and they're simply not.
That toxic culture, we'll get into some of that because the ways that we approach the toxic culture are going to be very important. Hey, just quickly on something very current, of course, you got Donald Trump in the US. He's found some ways of making whole nations take notice of drug issues. Does appear to be having some real effect there, even with, cartels sending drugs across the border from the south, from Mexico up into the US. The use of economic pressure, just the ways that he's been able to draw attention to the challenge that's happening for American families. This sort of economic pressure, any thoughts here from you as to what's been happening? And you might have your own ideas about whether you're optimistic about the year ahead, because this might actually be quite a good start for drug education.
Well, that's potentially true. One of the difficulties with and of course all measures undertaken to stop the flow, particularly of bulk amounts of substances, is a key issue. And supply reduction continues to be a priority, but it's always geared to demand, Neil. And one thing the listeners have to understand is no one supplies a product when there's no demand. It's as simple as that. If people aren't using a product, the product ends. The product line stops. So whilst, and sadly with obviously illicit drugs and any substances that has the potential to addict, is once you get a client, and particularly young people, that's the idea, get them early. Once you're addicted, then you've got a customer for life, arguably. Now, what Trump and others are trying to do, which is fantastic, is stop that the wholesale importation of these substances. But the difficulty is that there's also a concern that the Trump administration is soft on cannabis, and from a perspective of legalising it for recreational use, because it's seen by him or by his administration perhaps as a soft drug, which it clearly is not. And that's one of the issues that's also feeding and fueling the bigger drug crisis. The pro-cannabis lobby will tell you that, cannabis does not lead to other drug use. And we know from the science now, the evidence is in, the gateway theory, the gateway hypothesis is now tipped over into the fact that this is a clear issue. Cannabis, alcohol and tobacco are all gateway drugs to illicits. And the more young people are engaged in these substances, the chances of them stepping into the other space is huge. So, stopping supply is important, absolutely, but stopping demand is also important. So, there is some fresh hope in that space, but we really need to get, as you said, into the demand reduction space as well.
Some fresh hope, and we'll be coming down to the minutiae of what happens for individuals and in families around our conversation today, because this is where the education aspect is so important, because while there are all sorts of drug crises that are unfolding here on our doorstep in Australia, each individual family and each individual taking some level of responsibility for understanding these things, this has got to be the place where you start, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think that's where our advocacy for education is both top down and bottom up now. I think, we start with families, obviously kids. Schools are a great venue, a great sort of arena for that to happen. But then again, it has to be done from the top down as well. That's why we at the Dalgarno Institute advocate for legislation change and certainly focus on, actively instilling good demand reduction, primary prevention, resiliency building education into schools. And it's not being done because certain actors in the sector have sabotaged, I'll use that word sabotage, primary prevention, with hijacking of language. And unfortunately, we've tipped into a more harm reduction space now where there's basically a tacit, if not public declaration. Drug use is now basically normal. All kids are going to try it, part of the rebellion regime, which is complete rubbish. But that's what's going to be done, and we just need to manage the damage. So the message that kids are getting in that space, and parents have to hear this, they're getting the message that, your kids are probably going to do it, so just be careful how you manage it, which is an outrageous thing to be done in certainly public sector schools.
And almost outrageous to think that trusting the government, trusting authorities to look after your children at the bottom of the cliff, as that old expression goes, not a fence at the top, but the ambulance at the bottom, that really makes a challenging thing to be thinking about. I mean, you can even just, let me just run this is a bit of a scenario type situation. You've got two families, live opposite each other, different side of the street. One has a little bit of responsibility and wisdom around demand reduction. In other words, they're going to try and drug-proof their kids to resist the onslaught of what will happen with the peer pressure that comes later. The other side of the street, the family is saying, oh no, the government's got it, and a little bit of harm reduction, and you'll go out and try those things, you'll experiment here, experiment there, you'll be fine, you'll come through it with flying colours. What's the scenario that you can see out of your comparison between two households?
Well, of course, there's always variables in every setting, Neil, as you know that. And we know households that have done just what you said in the former one, with an incredibly high level of engagement with the young person, and not just in a prohibition sense or a hard line down the line kind of thou shalt not, because the thou shalt not's fine as long as it comes and is nuanced with a deep relationship and understanding of why you're saying this is not a good idea. But certainly, by all means, we've seen that primary prevention model, resiliency building in the family, teaching the kids about substances, not going into the depths of understanding drugs, what it does, but these substances are a symptom of a bigger problem, and they will undo you as a young person and undo you in the long run. So what does it look like? Why is that happening in our culture? Those conversations are really important for parents to have with kids, and schools should be reflecting that, not taking them on a different road because they're mandated. Not all schools do this, of course, but they're mandated by a harm reduction framework that, the kids are going to use drugs, just teach them how to use drugs safely. That is not good drug education. We're not saying the harm reduction is not part of the equation. We're not arguing that. In fact, we do speak of that at certain ways in our context, but it's always around the primary prevention framework. To delay or deny the uptake of drugs is a key issue here. The longer we delay or deny the uptake of drugs, the longer the developing brain has a chance to grow and become fortified, the less chance of substances creating a dependency and addiction framework for that kid.
A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. You can join in our conversation. You might have a question or a comment. 1800 316 316. Shane Varcoe is our guest from Dalgarno Institute. It's a health education charity. He teaches schools and families about all the issues that we're dealing with here. I wonder if we can give some attention to the states for a few moments. And I've got a few thoughts here to just offer, and I'll get your comment, Shane. State by state, and some things I picked up from a drug policy website. Victoria leading the pack in heroin, fentanyl and ketamine use. Not surprising that unintentional overdose deaths are on the rise in Victoria. For New South Wales, a preference for cocaine and MDMA. In South Australia, ice and cannabis usage rates are highest. Western Australia use the most MDA, a drug closely related to MDMA, with a street named called Sally. The Northern Territory struggling with alcohol use. The ACT ranking highly in heroin and oxycodone consumption. And Queenslanders consuming high rates of fentanyl, ketamine and MDMA. Increased fentanyl use has led to a large number of overdose deaths in the state in recent years. And for Tasmanians, cannabis and oxycodone, the drugs of choice. What comes to mind as those sorts of preferences come out, Shane?
Yeah, it's interesting, Neil, that and this is one of the difficult things to talk about in a public square that's been framed by certain language. And this is where harm reduction gets its teeth. In other words, the comments around harm reduction is we want to save lives. And how can you argue with that? We want to save lives. So you'll notice the data that they focus on heavily there is around the drugs that seem to do the most public harm. For example, opioids, and certainly that includes heroin, includes fentanyl. But what's fascinating in this space is they use the language overdose. And I'm going to, again, every chance I get, I'll put this into the marketplace because it's important. When you talk the term overdose, it's become an industry term. I've overdosed. Now, the bottom line is here, to your listeners, you cannot overdose on something that is not a prescribed drug. You cannot overdose on something that is not a prescribed drug. In other words, it's a pharmaceutical prescribed by a doctor. And if you're taking that drug recreationally or self-medication-wise and you OD on that, that's a legitimate overdose. Anything else is simply and tragically a poisoning. So when you have an episode on fentanyl, although that can be prescribed, but if heroin is not prescribed, so that is not an overdose, that's a poisoning. Crystal meth is an overdose, not an overdose, it's a poisoning. And so that's a really important distinction. But when you lose that language, people buy into that. We want to save lives. Of course we do. That's always a mantra. But the question is that the gold standard of drug education and drug care? No, we want to see people that before they get to the state where they are absolutely killing themselves on a regular basis and having to be brought back to life with the naloxone and Narcan and other, well, that's the same thing, opioid reversal mechanisms, very important tools. But we've got this situation where that becomes the gold standard. All of a sudden, you're starting to think, well, you're normalising drug use. People are going to do this. We just got to find ways to keep them alive while they keep using them, maybe exit. And that's the concern we have. So when you hear those stats, you're not hearing a lot about which the key drugs that are really problematic underneath this, of course, are cannabis and alcohol. They're driving much of this large, higher-end stuff. But it's the deaths that get the notification, understandably, so they get the attention. And then all of a sudden, all your focus is on preventing death, not preventing uptake, not preventing the substance use in the first place.
And that's where the harm reduction seems to take priority. What great wisdom. And let me just pause and reflect on that for a few moments, because often we don't think of that because we're hearing the terminology in the media. A drug overdose, another life lost. But as you say, an overdose can't be on something that's not prescribed. So everything that's taken that's not prescribed is like the consumption of a poison. And I always reflect on that terminology that you've introduced me to years ago, the thought of talking about drugs as psychotropic toxins. If we only think of drugs like it's a poison, we're going to be helping our children to be able to navigate that way forward. The way we think about that, the terminology is important, Shane.
Nomenclature matters. Fancy word, but that's the beauty about language change and language manipulation. Once you get hold of the narrative in the public square, you can make it dance. And the concern that we have is that those who have the microphone make the rules. It's the old adage. And so we're hearing a lot of these language, but that's starting to shift because people are starting to realise that we just can't keep talking about the same old mantras without addressing the real problems underneath this. And unfortunately, the education that young people are being subjected to, they might get 1 hour, maybe an hour and a half a year from an authorised educator like myself or a school teacher in their curriculum, but they're being educated on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, you name it. That's where they're getting their education from, where the pro-drug activists are out there peddling their wares of how to engage with a substance more safely, completely ignoring the developing brain dynamic. If you're 30 years and plus, your brain arguably is fully developed and the damage you do will vary from person to person. It's idiosyncratic. But for the developing brain, every substance use engagement, no matter how small, and of course, the younger the developing brain, So from the age of, say, well, there's kids as young as 7 and 8 and 9 using drugs, but teenage years onwards, every substance use does damage to the developing brain. And that also predetermines a lot of the factors, a lot of the elements, and a lot of the responses that create ongoing and lasting problems. And that's something that they're not told. Kids are not told. They're taught, hey, you get this buzz if you do that, if you try this. And that's the education they're being subject to. And that's where parents need to really be equipped to engage in that space, because heading that off is a key element in education.
Let me ask you about schools here, because you send teams into schools all over Australia, Shane. What sort of responses are you getting when your teams are confronting kids and relaying these things that we're talking about today into a classroom space?
Yeah, our coalition has a number of different teams that do go into schools nationally, statewide and nationally. And we have interaction with international groups as well and training in that space. But it's interesting when we go in, it's not just about the standard drug education from most practitioners. Is they talk about a drug, they talk about what it may or may not do, they talk about its potential harms, they talk about its chemistry makeup, and they talk about how you can minimise damage. They might even say, look, it's best not to use drugs until your brain's fully developed. That might be even in the conversation. But bottom line is there's kind of the tacit idea that you're probably going to do it anyway, so let's do it safer. So that kind of narrative is underlying a lot of the attitude. Now, teachers are amazing people, mate. They're not just teaching curriculum these days. They have the parent, nurse, counsel, behaviour management, and then on top of that, you say, can you teach them drug ed as well? It's a bit of a tough gig, and so they rely on whatever they're fed by the bureaucracy that's behind them. So if they're fed the standard, harm reduction line, that the kids are probably going to do drugs, we'd rather they didn't, of course. We're not saying it's a good idea. We're not saying you should use drugs, but you probably will. Therefore, do it safely. That kind of narrative is snuck in everywhere. But when we go into schools, we talk about context, Neil. And this is where parents can do this as well. Context is everything. We say to the young people, look, what you do, where you do it, how you do it, who you do it with, and why, and where is all important, but not as important as why. And the because factor is a key issue here. A lot of young people don't have a sustainable because, a reason why they shouldn't. And this is why good drug education is not only about what may or may not happen, but what are the drivers for this, and exposing those drivers, and particularly how young people are being manipulated. Because when we say, I've never met a young person yet who knowingly is okay about being manipulated, taken advantage of, coerced, seduced, and ripped off. No one, and all the kids are nodding, no one likes that. And when we unpack the drug itself, and also those who are peddling it, so it's the not just the supplier, but it's the friend, the trusted friend who positions the thing and say, hey, try this, it's okay, we all use it. Once you've got an understanding of what's going on behind that, and you frame that, and you talk about context, and talk about the capacity to actually make smart choices, and what that looks like in a resiliency framework, all of a sudden, and then kids see what's been happening behind the scenes, their eyes are open. We saw a lot of that, particularly around vaping and marijuana, when kids because they're all told to believe that marijuana is harmless and it's good for mental health, because kids who use weed are stressed out. They use weed, they're not stressed out anymore. But then they get back more stressed and double down on stress. They take more weed. And we know now it's completely antithetical to good mental health. Cannabis use, absolutely useless in that space. In fact, detrimental. However, in all of that, what we find is when we expose what's going on behind that, so the narratives that are framing what they're thinking, and then show them the truth behind that, but also look at, so what are the drivers that are going to help you say, step back from this and say, look, I really don't need to be in this space. What are the things in your space, and helping them visit that? That's been a key driver. Once they start looking at that, they've got the capacity to push back and go, well, I don't want to step into this psychotropic toxin engagement space. I don't need to. I don't want to, because I know what's going on, and I have other agendas in my life that I think are worth pursuing.
You give kids a reason to say no. Hey, we're taking calls, 1-800 316 316 to join in our conversation today. Let's take a call. Anne is in Labrador. Hey, Anne, welcome back.
Yeah, welcome back. I'm all agreeing what you're doing, but what I'm saying is that, the drugs, the prescription drugs, some people have to take it, like I had to take it when I had an operation on my shoulder because I had a replacement done. But sometimes these people get addicted to it and can't get off it. So do you have a program in that way that people can be helped to? Because sometimes even though prescription drugs are prescribed by the doctor, they get into a situation where they have to have it every time and they can't get set off release for them.
And I always appreciate when we actually get into the dimension too of prescription drugs because, from time to time there'll be a bit of a media blitz that's a crisis in drug use as well. Shane, what are your thoughts here for Anne?
Oh, Anne, thank you for that. I think it's an important distinction there. The opioid crisis that America has been highlighted as having been, it basically fell off a cliff into this space was all, I could argue, all but a very small amount was driven by prescription medication issues. Of course, not every person that was using oxycodone or hydrocodone or any of the other prescription opioids, was doing it because of pain and therefore got addicted, but they were just doing it recreationally. And a lot of elderly people were using their prescriptions and selling them in their area. So we had a real problem. But you're dead right. It is a shocking problem. And that's one of the reasons why there's been such a heavy pushback and such an extreme reaction, because that opioid crisis, the addiction to prescription drugs, overprescribed by predatory pharmaceutical companies. Let's be clear on that. Predatory pharmaceutical companies who knew the harms of this but hid them and continue to promote through doctors for pain management, because it does manage pain, yes, but they didn't talk about this potential for addiction. So the bottom line is stepping back out of that. We work with the recovery alumni. We don't provide that service, but it's surprising, not unsurprising, that NA and AA and those kind of groups, the 12-step programs, are still one of the best ways to exit drug use. There are pharmaceutical interventions that can help with that, but again, you've got the same problem. As long as you're weaning off the pharmaceutical and you're exiting drug use completely, it's fine. But replacement of therapies tend to lock people down into an ongoing opioid use. That may be a tiny bit less dangerous than the other one, but we strongly recommend engaging with 12-step programs. They are very, very effective. We know from the science now that they are effective. They're not bulletproof. There's no silver bullet, but they are effective. And so for those who are caught in that space, that's a first protocol. But certainly a doctor, speak to your medical professional about the addiction issue. That's an important thing. The doctor is your first protocol if it is a prescription addiction issue. Very important.
Anne, anything further?
Yeah, we actually have a drug thing in at our church that doing that steps that he was talking about.
Fabulous stuff. Perfect. And just we've got Anne here. I mean, is this something that churches can have more of a focus on? Because churches are a community body of people. They're planted in the community, and sometimes people within churches are seeking help because they've got some deeper either psychological or spiritual challenges that they're facing, and they come to their church and they're looking for help there. Is this something that churches could pick up on in a more significant way, knowing that the community is faced with these crises?
Look, Neil, I think community hubs are really important, and if the community hub, in this instance being a church, is seen as a respected and safe place in the community, by all means, that's an incredible vehicle. I know that a lot of church groups that we've worked with over the years, because they are that hub, they've got connections and they've got a building, they've got some resources, they've got people that are caring, they run play groups, they might host 12-step programs. We had Narcotics Anonymous in our office for a few years back for a number of about 12 or 18 months. We let them use our space. They pay us. They have to pay a fee. They insist on that. But they used our space. And it's interesting in that context, for your listeners, we had young guys coming in there they were young, as in 27 or 28. They were addicted to heroin, right, when they were 17, 18. They were given opioid substitute treatments or medically assisted treatments using medical-grade opioids called methadone, right, for example, and the methadone has got its place as long as it's used to help the person exit drug use. But this young fellow got off heroin, but he's addicted to methadone, and he went to NA to get off methadone. So that's just a classic example where NA, Narcotics Anonymous in this instance, one of the 12-step arrangements, helped this young fellow exit methadone use. So he replaced heroin with methadone, then he had to go 12-step to get off methadone. So that doesn't happen to everyone who uses methadone. We understand that. But we see a lot of people lining up every day for their methadone, and it's going on for years and years and years because they're not encouraged, they're not facilitated to exit drug use completely, which can be done, and the Recovery Alumni worldwide is proof of that.
And in Labrador, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. We're talking about drug education. Coming back to our kids, our teenagers, families, and the resilience that's necessary there, we brought this back to, what happens at home, what happens perhaps in your local church, what's happening in ways that can combat some of the bad messages that our kids are receiving. Because the bad messages, as you said, they're not just coming from individuals who might be even talking about these things in school. It's what's happening in social media. It's across all of the dimensions that are influencing our kids. Come back to those families for a moment and how you might actually build that resilience in, Shane.
Sure. I think one of the key issues in this space is it's an ongoing long-term project. Any parent who cares about their kids, and I'm probably understanding that to be, nearly all of your listeners, they care about their kids. And unfortunately, we don't always have the toolkit we need to make the difference. But the key issue in a family is obviously a loving, caring, warm, welcoming, supportive relationship, which sets good boundaries. Now, this is basic parenting 101, and we're not going to sit here to critique people who, their parenting styles. But boundaries are important, and boundaries can't shift. So when you have a family flavour and a family motif, and then a family set of values, it's really important. And a lot of people base their values on meta-narratives. For example, the Judeo-Christian worldview is an incredibly sustainable one and a very, very good one, historically borne out across cultures. But that's not the only one. Other worldviews do have weight as well. They have values that are very strong. And it's not just simply saying, hey, this is what we believe, you've got to believe it or else. It's about understanding why is this a good system? Why do we believe what we believe? Why have we set these values guides? And it's not because, we want you to be healthy. That's important. Healthy, strong, all those things are great. But what else is going on? Because as a young person's psyche is they're forming their identity. They're trying to figure out who they are. And they're doing that in a context. They're not in a bubble. They're doing it in a context where, unfortunately, in a school setting, often that's the environment. They're with peers all day long. So the only voice in their echo chamber is their peers. The only place that they're hearing from is their peers. And, of course, what is feeding that bubble? Now, it is a school, and hopefully the school's doing the right thing with policy and health. And most schools, in fact, 99.9% of schools aren't going to promote any drug use at all. So we know that's a no-brainer. But it's also what's influencing that peer group. And now we have social media, which is just an invasive contagion that is just feeding the kids. So understanding that space and what's being crafted and teaching the kid, your child, how to identify when they're being conned and set up. And that's not hard to do if you've got a good set of boundaries, a good set of principles and ideas, and then you engage with what's being said and have that conversation. And we teach teachers how to do that as well with our pedagogy when we do drug ed. And the kids see what we do and they go, oh, wow. They learn some critique skills that have been sort of excised from the curriculum, clear thinking, which was sort of excised years ago. But those kind of things are very, very important. And we also have coaching tools like the Humpty Dumpty Dilemma, which is a great coaching tool for any parent, any teacher, for kids from basically 14 up to 25. So that area, they can actually go through that. It's got PowerPoints, all free, and they can use that as a starter, a conversation starter for their kids.
The great thing is that there are resources that you can use because, let's, explore the scenario of, I can hear what you're saying, Shane, but my family is so dysfunctional, there's no room for any set of values. I can hear you talking about values there. If you don't have those values, if you can't rely on parents to be a good role model, or your grandparents, somewhere in the family that there's been someone who's done the right thing and not the wrong thing. Some people are really struggling. They just haven't got that set of values. But the resources that you can access, they can actually help you to turn over a new leaf and bring a new change. Tell us about those sorts of resources. You mentioned the no-brainer and those sorts of things, the resources families can use.
Certainly, Neil. Look, one of the things, we don't want to bang our drum. Clearly, that's not what we're here to do. We're here to empower and equip families to help their kids, but not just be safe, but actually be change agents. I think one of the things about good education, it's about empowering kids to be change makers in their culture. And what we've done is we've got a YouTube channel. We've got our World Resiliency Day platform now, which is for both teachers, parents and students. And that's kind of more of a global platform, which has got subscribers from all over the world attached and partnering, ambassadoring with us in that. And it's a good space to look at those kind of equipping tools, maybe for educators and parents more than kids. But we've also got a bounce back blog there and a bounce back questionnaire. It's called the bounce back Bungee questionnaire. It helps you figure out how resilient you may or may not be and where your holes might be and help you fill that. But what we also did a few years back, during COVID specifically, we created a series of educational resources, both video and PowerPoint, free of charge, all on the website, no-brainer website, called the Humpty Dumpty Dilemma Resiliency Project. And because we talk about Humpty Dumpty, fell off the wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the king's horses, and all the king's horses couldn't put Humpty together again, the king's soldiers and horses. The problem there is we've got this fragile individual. How did the individual get so fragile? What's a fragile individual doing in a precarious place? Did he fall or was he pushed? And why can't governments fix this? So we had to come up with a set of resources, evidence-based resources to help communities. Now, you can do it with a small group, like a youth leader or a teacher in a small group at school. You can do it with a parent. You can do it with a scout leader. You can do it with a chaplain. You can do it with a sporting club, coach. And you can have your little session, 20 minutes, 25 minutes at the most, and you can go through this. The pedagogy opens up things like why, context, what's going on, what are the things you can do to make it better, mindfulness exercises, everything you need in that context to start building resiliency. Certainly not the use-all and end-all of resilience, but to build resiliency, and more importantly, in the context of substance-using culture that continues to tell people this is normal behaviour. This is not normal behaviour. Drug-taking behaviour is not normal. It is destructive, and it's a lie that's been peddled to our kids.
What can we say about friends? The thought, our friends, sometimes our friends have got good values, sometimes they don't. That sort of corruption of good character, that's a biblical principle too that we might talk about on this program. But being a good friend to someone who's vulnerable or looking for a good friend to help you overcome your own vulnerabilities here, this is something I guess all families are involved in as well, because it's families and it's friends. It's people who are influences outside of our families. What are your thoughts here? Is there any advice here for parents who are thinking about their own teenagers, their young people who are going through these things? Any thoughts around friends?
Certainly. One of the difficulties with education, the shift again, is where the narrative has shifted. Even 10 years ago, the clear international standard around education narratives for deviant behaviour, which was called deviant behaviour, was that when in a peer group or a peer setting or in a school setting, a certain behavioural conduct began to manifest, then the key issue was not to get rid of that child, but to manage that child better, as best you can, isolate them without creating stigma, but then working on that child, helping that child develop and working with that child's obviously home environment to make better choices. So their behaviours modify at school, and they're using other kids to help them modify. But what happened with the drug education space, and this is really cynical and quite sinister, is that about 10 years ago they started to push the harm reduction narrative hard. That if a kid was showing up in the classroom, you had 2 or 3 kids using weed, then the narrative wasn't, hey, the rest of the class is doing the right thing, let's talk about demand reduction, challenge those kids to get off, help them get off drugs. No. The new narrative was, we need to teach kids how to use marijuana safely because they're using it. So 3 kids in the classroom are using it. The other 25 are then exposed to harm reduction, how to use weed safely. And all of a sudden the kids are going, okay, so now we need to know this because this is what we all do. And so those contagions have to be reversed. And good practice is always about helping good contagions infect those who are struggling or in those spaces where they're disruptive. But that requires not just a peer setting, but those above it and those governing that peer setting. And, of course, that's where parents are involved, particularly in schools when the school is not doing the right thing with drug ed and they're exposing all their kids to how to use drugs safely, because there might be 10% of the school cohorts using, and everyone has to be taught how to use drugs, rather than saying, no, this is not good normal behaviour. We're going to address that. Those guys are caught in a bad space. We're going to help them. Hey, let's all help them get out of drugs, not let's all help them join in by saying this is okay. We're going to validate this drug use by being educated at it. And that kind of shocking misuse of education is one of the issues that we're combating at the moment.
Well, it is a real challenge, and I know that every listener who's been listening carefully will appreciate that there are some dimensions here that need attention in every family, with every young person, and with every ordinary adult as well, who's going through all of these sorts of things, the things that we've been exposed to, the things we've been influenced or manipulated by over so many years. Well, to connect with Shane Varcoe, who is our special guest this hour, he's the CEO at Dalgarno Institute, and the website for Dalgarno Institute is dalgarnoinstitute.org.au. And they have some fabulous resources. One of those that we mentioned a time or two called the No Brainer newsletter. And it'll just arrive in your inbox and will be filled with all sorts of amazing wisdom, the sort of wisdom you're hearing on the program here today with our special guest, nobrainer.org.au. There's also a YouTube channel. And Shane, for listeners who like to surf YouTube and look for some of these sorts of things, what are they going to see when they look for Dalgarno Institute or the No Brainer on the YouTube channels?
You're going to get a lot of various things. Of course, some of the things I spoke about, certainly our Humpty Dumpty program, we've got a lot of issues around substances, but more importantly about what substances are doing and what are some of the contagions involved. So that's really important. We've also got a YouTube channel for our Unnecessary Harm podcast, which is something that's been going about 12 months now, and that's becoming quite popular. And so the Unnecessary Harm podcast's got its own shorts as well. And, of course, we've got the World Resiliency Day platform with its own YouTube channel as well. And those resources are all free, easy to download. They're on Spotify for the podcast as well, but they've got their own websites as well.
Okay. Shane Varcoe, wonderful getting your insights. I want to thank you so much for being part of 2020 once again, sharing your wisdom. And the wisdom is just so obvious when you start to hear a narrative that's different to the sorts of things that are actually getting us into deeper water around drugs. And there's more of a drug conversation coming up too in just a few minutes. We'll be chatting with a leader and a couple of almost graduates out of a drug rehab in Tasmania. Look forward to that. That's just coming up in just a few minutes. Shane Varcoe, thanks so much for joining us once again today on 2020.
Always a pleasure, Neil, and thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.